Although we still have 1 week to go until the election, over 50 million votes have already been cast in the 2024 contest. These early voting figures for the Republicans are looking rather good. Early voting is practically drowning Kamala Harris under Trump. These figures show Democrats at 42, Republicans at 40. But you also have to take into account that these independent voters, those who neither identify with either party in terms of their party registration, break more for Trump than for Harris. When compared to 2020, this is where we most clearly see change. Democrats were at 45%, Republicans at just 30%. The GOP was losing in the early vote, but this time it is essentially a tie. These are the early voting figures from 4 years ago. This is yet another indication that Trump is en route for a huge electoral college triumph. And thus, in this video, we will be examining the 2024 electoral map derived from early voting numbers and contrasting it with what we observed 4 years ago. We will thus start off right off the bat, filling in Missouri, Kentucky, Mississippi, and Alabama. These are 4 states where we obviously lack early voting records, but they most definitely will go to Trump by strong margins, exactly as they have in the past 2 cycles. We also will complete the remaining safe states for both contenders. These are the races that are simply not competitive. In terms of choosing the next president, they ultimately won't really count too much. For Trump then, we also have North and South Dakota, as well as Utah, Wyoming, Idaho, and Montana. Except for its 2nd district, we have all of Nebraska plus Kansas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, Tennessee, Indiana, West Virginia, South Carolina, and Alaska. Kamala Harris is going to readily carry Washington, Oregon, California, as well as Hawaii, Illinois, New York, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, and the District of Columbia. The 1st district of Maine is solid blue, and the 2nd is solid red. And thus the map now shows just the 17 most competitive races, though they comprise less than half of the Electoral College. When it comes to selecting our next president, they have an overwhelming majority of the deciding weight. We will begin our journey westward in Nevada, where Democrats are in great hot water. 4 years earlier, they led in early voting. 4 points separated them from each other. Democrats at 39, Republicans at only 35. But these days, things have entirely changed. Right now, the GOP finds itself leading. At merely 35, they are 40% Democrats. We so moved from a Democrat plus 4 environment now to a Republican plus 5. On a map, Nevada will be lean Republican. Trump definitely will turn the state around. Since the early Obama era, Democrats have not really improved the silver state since the state has been trending right ever since in 2022. They chose a Republican governor who kicked a common Democrat from office in Arizona nearby. For the vice president, things remain unchanged. Joe Biden trailed just 3% in the early voting, 35% for Democrats, 38% for Republicans 4 years ago. With these figures, Biden also won Arizona by 0.3%, making history as the first Democrat to do so since 1996. Republicans have grown their lead, though, for 2024. Right now, they are just 35% and 42% Democrats. Additionally noteworthy is the fact that Republicans consistently cast more personal votes on Election Day. GOP turnout is going to rise significantly on November 5th. Moreover, it will be difficult for Democrats to catch up if their early voting lag by 7 points already. Arizona will hence also be lean Republican. Turning now to Colorado and New Mexico, Kamala Harris's situation just gets bad. 2 Democrats oversaw 4 years ago, lead by 3 this time, and here Kamala Harris seems to be in good shape. Looking at the age breakdown, though, you will soon see she is really in a lot of trouble. In terms of age, the 65 in the overgroup is the most crucial voting bloc. They constantly break sharply in favor of the GOP and are always more active than younger voters. And review the early 2020 voting figures. In Colorado, 23% were 65 and over. That figure has exploded to 45 today. For Republicans, this is absolutely a benefit. And Colorado will become among the most competitive races in the nation if this trend keeps on. Not even going to be likely Harris. Biden actually scored 14 points to win Colorado. The vice president hardly will break 7 at all. On our map, it will show as lean blue. Things in New Mexico are rather similar. Democrats comprised 49% in 2020. This is 49% once more. And upon perusing these pages, you will find two graphs. Your attention should be on the bar displaying the actual vote count. These folks who merely asked for a ballot never really turned around to vote. And thus, depending just on party registration, it could seem as though Democrats are headed toward repeat victory in New Mexico. However, when you divide the voting by age, you will find that most of them fall into the 65 or above group. For Republicans, this is quite welcome news since just 42% of the early voting electorate in 2020 came from the 65 or over grouped. Furthermore, quite competitive will be New Mexico as well. Actually, on this map, it will be tilt blue. Republicans are not a good place down in Texas either. 4 years ago, they stood at 53%. Right now, they stand at 52%, though this may seem like a minor drop-off. The age statistics show that the 65 and older group is at 36. Their count in 2020 was just 26. And this draws attention to yet another major problem for Kamala Harris. Courting younger voters has been one of her main tactics for electoral success, and they have simply not been showing up for her. 4 years ago, the 18 to 29 group had a 14%. Today, we only have 9. Although younger voters tilt strongly toward Democrats, the Democratic Party has no chance of winning this race if they are not showing up. Texas will thus essentially show on our map as absolutely pure red. Trump's biggest margin ever will help him to triumph in the Lone Star State. We are not going to discuss Georgia moving forward. Before headed to the Midwest, we will wrap up the Sun Belt. Georgia early voting in 2020 thus favored Republicans by 8%. They voted Republicans by 4 today. Not too much of a shift here. One other important thing you should keep in mind, though, is how drastically early in-person ballots differ from mail-in ballots. You can vote early in person during the days and weeks before Election Day. Mail-in ballots can, however, be sent in up to 2 months occasionally before November 5th. And thus, when you examine the figures, you have to take into account that Republicans strongly prefer voting early in person over voting by mail. Thus, as more and more people vote early in person as Election Day approaches, these figures will only rise for Republicans. Mail-in ballots account for a great majority of the votes cast thus far in Georgia. These will greatly favor Democrats, and thus Georgia offers more encouraging news for Republicans. On our map, it will show as lean red. Now, just look at Florida if you wish to observe a significant transformation. Actually, what Republicans have accomplished here over the past 4 years is amazing. From essentially the most competitive state in the nation, they made the Sunshine State among the least. Looking at the early voting figures from 4 years ago, Republicans and Democrats were rather closely matched. It came out 39-38 in favor of the Democrats. With the already recorded 5.1 million early votes, Republicans now lead greatly. Last time, it was a draw. Republicans are at 45 this time. Democrats are at just 34. Florida will thus most likely be mapped as Republican. Trump clearly stands likely to win the state with a double-digit margin. We will now concentrate on North Carolina, another state where early voting results have changed from favoring Democrats to Republicans. 2020 saw Democrats lead by 5 points. Republicans at just 32, they were at 37. Republicans have utterly turned things around today. Actually, they lead now by 1%. The GOP at 34, the Democrats at 33. Furthermore, keep in mind that Republicans are only going to raise their vote share as more early in-person votes are registered daily. North Carolina is a good illustration of a state that has been moving left as well. Democrats just haven't been able to break the code. Over the past 10 years, they have been investing hundreds of millions of dollars in winning North Carolina, but they just haven't been able to do it. Joe Biden was outstanding in the early voting for 2020. Things were looking good. Though he was ahead in the polling average to run the whole cycle, he still lost 1.3%. If Trump could hold the Tar Heel state 4 years ago, he could most certainly do it against Kamala Harris, where he is actually leading in early voting counts. North Carolina thus will also be a lean Republican. Right now, the GOP dominates all 4 of the battlefields we have visited. By 8%, Democrats led in the early votes as finishing the South with Virginia in 2020 today. They lead by 14. Again, though, you have to keep in mind that many early in-person votes haven't been recorded and will cause the Republican count to rise. You also have to factor age. Republicans are doing well with the 65 and over group today. 45% of the ballots returned thus far in the Commonwealth of Virginia came from senior citizens. This figure was merely 32 in 2020. See the young votes, really. For Joe Biden, currently just 8%, 16% for Kamala Harris. Virginia will thus be yet another fiercely competitive state that Joe Biden won by a double-digit margin in 2020. It also will be tilt blue. We will now be heading up to the Midwest, where Kamala Harris's whole campaign depends on her success in winning Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. She cannot afford to lose even one of 4 of these states. I thus begin in Minnesota, where Kamala Harris leads by 23 points in the early votes thus far. 4 years prior, Joe Biden guided with 13. These independent voters show a significant increase. Just consider their age. Given Donald Trump's advantage, they most certainly come from the 65 or over group. And you also have to take into account that early in-person ballots differ greatly from mail-in ballots. Although you can mail in a ballot on any given day, there are only a few days when voting early in person is really feasible. Thus, a great majority of these votes once more originate from these mail-in ballots, which favor Democrats disproportionately. Minnesota will thus be lean blue as well. Though she won't be breaking Joe Biden's margin, the early voting figures here aren't horrible. He won 7. The vice president will most definitely perform worse. Turning now down to Iowa, Democrats had a great edge in 2020. Their leading point count was 12. This was eventually a state Joe Biden lost by 8 points. However, Democrats are in even more trouble in 2024 today. Regarding the party registration from which the early votes have come, we find essentially a tie. For Republicans, it is 39. For Democrats, 42. With these figures, Trump is quite likely to win Iowa by a clear margin. Right now, it will be his best performance in the state. 2016 saw him flip the state. Though Joe Biden was expected to be a far better candidate than Hillary Clinton, he clung to it in 2020 by essentially the same margin. And thus, Iowa will be deep red, with the early votes essentially tied. Although we lack data particular to the 2nd District of Nebraska, all things considered, it will be lean blue. We do have numbers from Wisconsin. In 2020, Democrats stood at 35%. They barely have an increase today, they are just 36. Though they break mostly in favor of Trump, we do observe that there is a far bigger population of unaffiliated voters now. It is thus not really too much of a concern. Naturally, we also have a lot more early morning in-person voting scheduled, and this will also benefit Republicans rather greatly. Actually, half of the past due older ballots have already been cast by those 65 or older. This figure was merely 34 in 2020. More excellent news for Republicans then. And Kamala Harris here suffers from the unfortunate inability to lose Wisconsin. She cannot vanish from Michigan. She cannot drop Pennsylvania either. And on the first of the 3 we have examined, Wisconsin is presently headed toward voting for Trump. In 2016, he won the state by 0.7. Most likely, he will be able to win it by more than 2 this time. Additionally, not looking good in Michigan is Kamala Harris. Among all the 7 swing states, this is the most liberal. Michigan will be her winner among the 7 battlegrounds if she wins anyone at all. Actually, Fox News lately changed Michigan from the lean Democrat column to be a toss-up. They also recently classified Arizona as lean Trump instead of tossing up. And so the former president is gaining all over the map. Not exception is Michigan. With the early return ballots in 2020, Democrats lagged 2 points. Democrats lead today by just 7 points, so a smaller margin than even what we observed in Wisconsin. By age, 53% are 65. And older, just 8% come from younger voters considering the 2020 figures. 13% fit the 18 to 29 range. And thus, Michigan is a state Kamala Harris just cannot ignore. Should Michigan go, she will lose the election in a modern-day landslide as Trump grabs every single swing state, possibly including more. Looking at these graphs, you may find, perhaps in some of the swing states, that Democrats are somewhat ahead, but this is not where they should be, and they are aware of. That is the reason they are panicking. Michigan is going to be lean Republican. Dead in Ohio, early voting statistics for 2020 have been rather similar here. The Republicans had 48 to 38 in advantage. It's 49 to 42 today. Once more in favor of the Republicans, the Buckeye State has already seen almost 2 million votes cast. This state consistently votes quite like Iowa, another state where GOP numbers are rather decent. Still, Iowa does slink slightly more to the right than its other Midwestern neighbor. Ohio will thus most certainly fall into the likely red category. Though it's not going as far for him as Iowa, I absolutely see Trump winning by significant margins here. And now, to round off Midwest, Pennsylvania is here. The great one is this: both campaigns give Pennsylvania great significance. Trump also finds winning the election much simpler since, should he win Pennsylvania, all he will need is North Carolina and Georgia along with it. Michigan is not needed by him. He won't need Nevada or Arizona nor Wisconsin. And thus, early voting numbers for the GOP in Pennsylvania show some quite encouraging trends for 2020. It was 25% Republican, 65% Democrat, just 59% Democrat, and 31% Republican today. Here the GOP finds themselves in rather good shape. We still have early in-person voting for the whole next week. Kamala Harris is not likely going to win the Keystone State. Josh Shapiro should have been her running buddy. The wise decision would have been that one. Tim Walz, after all, was a total flop in the debate opposing J.D. Vance. Pennsylvania is also going to be lean red. Consequently, the Republican nominee is clearly favored in all 7 of the battlegrounds nowadays. New Hampshire and Maine will help us to complete the map in the Northeast. Examining Granite State's 2020 figures, we found Democrats at 50%, Republicans at barely 21%. More than 2 to 1 4 years ago, Republicans were outnumbered. But today, Democrats count only 39. Republicans at 33. It almost comes out as a tie. Trump can actually win New Hampshire, a state he is visiting. Really, he came within half a percentage point of beating Clinton in 2016, and so the state of New Hampshire will once more be tilt blue today. Though they certainly are cutting it close, Democrats are still preferred. Though Maine does not show such a striking change, Republicans have also improved here. Democrats 2 to 1, exactly 48 to 24, outnumber Republicans twofold in 2020. Still, they are ahead by just 17 points today. Republicans gained. Today their count is 27. Democrats now barely score 44. And thus Maine will be lean for Kamala Harris. And thus, more than 25% of the expected vote has already been cast as the 2024 election is under progress. At 42% Republicans, Democrats at just 40%. For Republicans, this is rather welcome news. These early voting totals, which match 2020, favored Biden by 15%. By 2020, the voting early and in-person differences between Democrats and Republicans were rather evident. And if those patterns held true, this is how the 2024 electoral map would show. Still, I do expect those trends to somewhat fade. At least proportionately, I observe more Democrats voting on Election Day and more Republicans voting early. Consequently, the GOP won't get as much of a boost as they would have from Election Day voting. We will thus gently alter this map here as well. States like Colorado and New Mexico will see Kamala Harris perform rather better. While Iowa and Texas are probably red, Virginia and New Hampshire could be moved into the lean blue columns. And maybe Nevada and Michigan also get rather more competitive. Still, there are no significant flips